This may sound strange, but to crime scene investigators, there's something peaceful about working with the dead. No matter how a victim's life ended, they all have a story to tell. That is, if somebody is willing to listen. For more than 30 years, Howie Ryan has been that guy. Most of that time as a state police crime scene investigator. Today, he's a crime scene reconstruction consultant and expert witness, and teacher of state-of-the-art forensic techniques to law enforcement agencies worldwide. He has worked scenes you wouldn't want to experience in your worst nightmare. This podcast series will pull back the sheet on what really happens in the world of forensic investigations. It's not like what you see on TV. So hold on tight as we take a walkthrough of some gruesome crime scenes and controversial cases, many of which are too brutal for most people to imagine, and sometimes even for the experts. Join Howard Ryan and his guest experts from around the world for a no-nonsense ringside seat as they take you under the yellow tape.
Under the Yellow Tape podcast is brought to you in part this week by Highlands Forensic Investigations and Consulting. Let us be your guide from crime scene to courtroom. Also brought to you by CRG Plans. CRG, Critical Response Group, making our world safer each day. If you're a parent with school-age children from kindergarten to university, take a look at CRG Plans and see how they're making the world safer for you, your family, your children, and your community. That's crgplans.com. Now let's get to it. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Under the Yellow Tape. I'm your host, Howie Ryan. This episode, we're going to pick up where we left off in the last episode. We're discussing the murder of Ryan Poston, a young man whose life was taken in October of 2012. He was shot and killed by his girlfriend, Shayna Hubers. In the first episode, we talked a lot about the scene in general, crime scenes, not just specifically to that case, but crime scenes in general and things that need to be done and accomplished at a crime scene in order to bring a case to trial. I want to pick up with this case, talking about this specific scene and some of the things about the scene that became very important in putting this set of events and facts together to present to a jury. The Highland Heights Police Department in this particular case, they documented the scene. They collected a lot of evidence there. They went through it systematically. And when you do it right, you're able to uh, start to put the pieces together. And there's many facets to a homicide investigation. There are interviews, there are statements, there are excited utterances, as we call. There's 911 calls and tapes of what was said on the phone. And one of the things we established in the first episode was that Shane Hubers was contradicting herself in some of the statements she gave, and she was being deceptive. And when we look at what she said, it was quite obvious that she was all over the place, which should make you focus even more on the physical evidence side of the case, and that's what they did here. So let's talk about the scene. We explained earlier there was a dining room table in a nook in a condo, kind of a small area. She gave contradicting statements about he carried her outside, she went back in to get her things, she grabbed a hold of a gun. Another statement, he grabbed a hold of a gun, she wrestled it away from him, things of that. Later on, it came out that she said he was on the opposite side of the dining room table with his back to the wall, either seated or getting up. She said he began to get up. And she gave the statement that he grabbed the gun and that she fought it away from him. She wrestled it away from him. She took control of the firearm and fired at him. When you get a statement like that, you have to marry it up to or compare it to what the physical evidence actually says. So a lot of times when we look at one of these cases, I don't want to know the statements right away. I want to just look at what the physical evidence says. I want to remain as objective as I can, and I want to be tainted, if you will, by a statement of somebody, especially contradictory statements that are all over the place. You want to stay away from the banter from the investigators, just the suggestions that other people have, and most of all, every law enforcement agency has this. We call it the theory guy or the theory girl. It doesn't matter if it's a guy or a girl. There's always some detective that has the theories, and they're the ones at every case. They're standing there with a cup of coffee in their hand. They're saying, "Hey, got a minute?" And then they bring you over and they want to walk you through this thought process that they have. Sometimes they're actually pretty good. Sometimes they're so bizarre, you just shake your head and go, "I can't believe you just said that." But you want to avoid those people. You just want to follow that physical evidence. What is it? What is it? Let's gather it. Let's collect it. Then let's break it down and see what it means. In this particular case, let's start with the room. I mentioned in the first episode that the dining room table had a substantial amount of clutter on it. There was a lot of things on the table, with glasses with liquid in it, beverage or something. There were some boxes. There was some gun cleaning equipment. He had obviously cleaned his firearm. There was some other things. There was pill bottles, I believe. It was cluttered. The entire surface of the table was cluttered. One of the things she brought up was later on was that there was a struggle for the gun across the table. She was on one side, he was on the other. You have to ask the question, is that even possible? Or what would our expectations be of all those items on the table if there was a struggle? Now, you might say, well, I don't know. It could be things could have been knocked around or not. We're talking about a struggle for a gun. This is what she's saying. We're talking about a struggle for a firearm. And the struggle for a firearm usually doesn't end well for one side or the other. So we're not talking about we're struggling for a chocolate chip cookie here. We're talking about struggling for a firearm. That tends to be a little bit more violent. And if that were to happen, would your expectations be of these items on the table? Mine would be that some of it would have been knocked over, knocked to the floor. The table might have been cleared, and things could have been everywhere, scattered. In this particular case, there was nothing out of place. It was clutter, and it looked like it remained right where everything was, with one exception. The flat area of the table surface directly in the chair that she had explained Ryan Poston had been sitting in which we were able to determine he was. The flat table surface had a substantial amount of pooled blood on the table surface. And then there was some wipe patterns that traveled through this blood. And when we have that occur, it can sometimes give us direction of movement. In this particular case, it did. Within that pool of blood were a pair of eyeglasses. The lenses, the exterior, the front face of the lens was down in the blood. And the pieces that go over your ear on a pair of glasses, sunglasses or eyeglasses, it's called the temple tips. Temple tips are pointing straight up in the air. Anybody that wears glasses knows you don't take your glasses off and put them down lens to the surface of the table. They'd be scratched. So it's an unusual way for the glasses to be situated. It comes into play a little bit later because of a previous statement that she said. Later, when he was on the floor, when she went over, he still had his glasses on. That would not be the case. And those little things sometimes add up. Little things add up to big things. And one of the injuries, and I'm going to go from injuries to blood and back to injuries to blood. I'm going to walk through them a little bit and why they became important. One of the injuries that Ryan Poston sustained was to the edge of his right forehead. A bullet struck him in the right side of the forehead, traveled under the skin, partially exited over his right ear. Some of it stayed in, some of it exited. Now, people say, well, it was more like a grazing shot or a tangential shot. How could it have incapacitated him? One of the things that was brought up by the defense early on was that Mr. Poston was ambulatory, meaning he was moving around. He could move around. Okay, so let me just give you a little bit of background on the bullet strike to the head. First of all, I think it's very important we talk about the gun and what it means to that gunshot to his head. So the pistol in question here that was used in this incident was a Sig Sauer Model P238. Okay, it's a 380 caliber semi-automatic, or what they call autoloader. A semi-automatic pistol. Now, there's been a lot of talk about guns lately. Guns, gun violence, gun violence, gun violence, gun violence. And there's been a lot of probably miscommunication with regards to firearms. And the miscommunication or the falsities or falsehoods, I guess we should say, about most anything that we hear about today falls squarely on the shoulders of our media. They suck. And I've said that in podcasts in the past. The day it became obvious they had a side, and their side wasn't objectivity. Their profession went in the shitter pretty quick. But they talk about guns like crazy now, right? Because it's become a political issue. Why is it important that we explain this gun to a jury when we get into a courtroom? Well, because it was a shooting. And they need to know what this gun is capable of. They need to know how it operates, and they need to know what it really means. So when you hear somebody say, well, it's an automatic pistol, that's not correct. In the world of firearms, there is automatic and there is semi-automatic as far as those types of pistols. And there's revolvers, and they're all different, right? A semi-automatic and an automatic differ in that a semi-automatic, a cartridge will be discharged or a bullet will be fired with each depression of the trigger. Where, as in an automatic, one depression of the trigger and holding it down would cause multiple rounds to fire. That's an automatic fire. You'll hear the term select fire or automatic, and that's the big difference. Now, why is that different? Why is that different? Well, if you depress the trigger on an automatic weapon and 5 rounds fire off, very rapid rate, right? Like a machine gun type thing. Those 5 rounds the gun may rise, bullets can go different directions, whatever it may be. But it's one depression of the trigger. The significance in a semi-automatic firearm is every time you depress that trigger, a bullet is being fired. In a shooting, there's always 3 things we look at. A person's perception of an incident, and this is the mental component of a shooting, their perception of an incident. They know they're going to do it. Whatever reason why. I'm angry, I hate you, I'm scared, I'm defending myself, whatever it might be. They're making that perception. It's in their head. The next one is the cognitive part where they actually decide to pull the trigger. So there's I'm going to pull the trigger, then they're actually, or there's an incident that causes them to think about pulling the trigger, I should say, in the first part. Then there's the actual I'm going to pull the trigger. That's the cognitive decision. And then there's the actual execution of pulling the trigger. And you might say, yeah, that sounds like a lot of noise. What does that mean? Well, the human being has to see a reason to do this. And the reason could be they want to. I want to shoot you in the face. I'm going to do that. I'm going to shoot you to defend my family. I'm going to shoot you to defend my partner. I'm going to shoot you, whatever reason. I see this threat. So the first part is the perception of the threat or the opportunity to do this. The second part is the actual decision. I'm going to do it. The third part is component where you actually execute it and do pull the trigger. Because at any time you can stop yourself. Well, in a case like this where we have 6 rounds fired, that is 6 individual bullets being fired by 6 individual pulls of the trigger. And for each one of those, we can attribute those 3 steps I just gave you. For each one. That becomes significant. She fired 6 rounds. She hit him 6 times. That also becomes very significant, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So in a firearm, now this is a semi-automatic pistol. Sig Sauer. It's a 380 caliber. What happens, and some of you may or may not know this, and a lot of you do, and if you do, that's bear with me for a minute. The trigger is pulled. That sets the firing pin in motion. The firing pin then strikes the primer, ignites the primer powder, which in turn ignites the powder in the cartridge. That explosion occurs within the cartridge within the gun. When that happens, that pressure from that explosion has to go somewhere. So it is being applied in a lot of different directions, but it's going to take the path of least resistance. And what that is the back end of the projectile, the bullet itself that's seated in the cartridge. And it pushes that down the barrel of the gun. Now, I made it sound very graceful and slow. It's not. It's a violent, very fast thing. So you have an explosion that pushes this piece of lead spiraling down the barrel because there are lands and grooves in the barrel for accuracy, and the bullet is sent out into the environment at a very high rate of speed. What a lot of people fail to stop and think about, once you explain it to them, it becomes very obvious. When that explosion occurs, what happens in a semi-automatic pistol is one of two things. Well, one thing happens. The slide at the very top recoils backwards and cycles, we call it, cycles back. As it cycles back, it grabs the empty cartridge that was just fired and it ejects it out what we call an ejection port, and it sends it into the air, usually to the right of the weapon. As that slide now cycles forward, it is designed to grab the next bullet in the magazine, which is located within the pistol grip, and take that bullet and force it forward into the chamber to fire again. Nothing else has to be done except another pull of the trigger to fire the next round. And this happens very, very fast. So as fast as you can pull that trigger, you're not as fast as this gun cycling. So it happens very quickly. So 6 shots can go off very quick or they can go off very slow, but you don't have to do much except pull the trigger. Now in that explosion, in addition to the cycling of the weapon and reloading itself, in addition to the projectile or the bullet leaving the firearm, there is also the gunpowder, which has been ignited. So what else? The other material that exits the firearm through the barrel, through the ejection port, and in different directions, is some of that gunshot residue, the powder. So some of it is burnt, some of it is partially burnt, and some of it is still yet unburnt as it projects itself along with the bullet out of the muzzle of the firearm, out of the barrel, downrange. The difference between the bullet and the gunshot residue is that the bullet's heavy. It has a lot of density, and it's going to travel a long way very fast. The gunshot residue does not have that density. So it's going to come out just as fast, but it's not going to go that far. And that becomes a very critical piece of information for the crime scene investigator and for the shooting and people analyzing the shooting. It will only go so far. So the bullet may strike a surface, maybe a person, maybe go in, maybe go through, maybe it misses them altogether. But the bullet's small. What happens with the gunshot residue is it spreads as it goes out in a conical type of formation, kind of like birdshot or buckshot out of a shotgun. As it gets further away from the gun, it spreads wider and wider. That will hit different surfaces, but it won't travel so far. Now, the unique thing about this is each gun is slightly different, and the amount of powder that comes out of that gun is different, but it goes down range. So it's not going to go far, but each one's only going to throw at a certain distance. And what we can do is we can test that later. We can test that firearm with that ammunition and try to recreate that dispersion of powder. When that powder hits a surface, it can stay there. Now, you might have vaporous powder. You might have larger pieces of the powder that hit a surface and leave an impact mark. And if they do, it becomes very important. When they hit the surface, sometimes they can impact. We call it a punctate impact. But what it does for us as the investigators is it allows us to give a muzzle to target distance. One of the most important questions, and one of the things most often overlooked in shootings, is the distance between your shooter and the target, whatever the target that is struck by the bullet. If you're investigating a shooting, one of the first questions is, don't you want to know how far apart they were? Because it might lend a lot of credibility to a statement, or it might completely blow somebody's statement up. Depends on how you look at it. So when we do that and we look at these distances, it helps us put things together. So the reason I explained this to you, and I took the time to kind of break it down in a simplistic terms, and some of you might be shaking your head saying, "Who doesn't know this?" Well, a lot of people don't. You'd be surprised how many people in law enforcement don't. It's to let you know that other things other than a bullet come out of the gun, and we look at them, and they become very important. In this particular case, Ryan Poston, on some of his injuries, had what we call stippling, which was identified by the medical examiner. And stippling is a byproduct of that gunshot residue coming from the gun. Okay. And sometimes we look at the skin, sometimes we look at the clothing, and we want to see what it is and what it looks like. So on the skin, stippling can consist of multiple punctate abrasions. It's an impact. It's an impact from the gunpowder in flight. And when it impacts the skin, it leaves a mark. It leaves an impression, almost a red abrasion, like an impact abrasion mark. And sometimes that stippling and the shape and size and spread of that stippling can help us determine how far away that muzzle was from that skin that took the impact. And that is very important. That can be very important for us. The interesting thing, too, about stippling is a bullet may pass through several different things before it comes to rest. It may pass through a wall before it hits a person, or a window before it hits a person. The stippling will not. So it's important to note that if we do have stippling on the skin of a victim that has been shot, that there really was nothing in between them and the muzzle. And in this particular case, that became important because there were several areas on his body that had stippling present. And when we break that down, it says a lot about where he was, the position that he was, and the position that she was as the shooter. So let's go back to his position. When you show up at a scene, and the Highland Heights Police Department in this case showed up at the scene, they found Ryan Poston on the floor, behind a dining room table, to the right of the chair that was at the table. Substantial amount of blood on the table, as I said. There was also blood on the surface of the chair. Now, obviously, there was a lot of blood on him. So you can't just look at it like there's a lot of blood. You have to actually say, well, where was it? And what does it look like? So there's a thing called bloodstain pattern analysis, and it is like you're basically looking at you're giving a geometric interpretation of bloodstain evidence. Where is it? What does it look like? How did it get here? And there's certain mechanisms that we can go to say this is what this specific blood pattern means. If we can do that, sometimes we can say what it means to an event. Well, he had a substantial amount of blood on him and around him. There was blood on the chair. There was blood on the wall behind him, which became a very important piece of evidence. The impact that he took to the right side of his forehead. When we look at somebody and we say, well, he was shot in the forehead, it was only a 380. I wouldn't use the term only a 380, because I'm going to tell you something right now. A bullet traveling out of a 380 handgun, and I'm going to give you an average here, but it gives you an idea of the impact on the head and what it actually means. It's moving at about 980 feet per second. And in the first episode, I talked about being a professional investigator and a professional witness. When you go into court and you start talking about velocity of bullet travel, and you might have to do that as an expert, and you tell a jury that the bullet moved at 980 feet per second, your average juror, your average person says, wow, that sounds fast. They don't really have anything to relate it to in their life. Like, what do they measure in feet per second to give them some sort of benchmark to say, how fast is that? Convert that. So the bullet struck Ryan Poston's head at 670 miles an hour. If you don't think that's incapacitating and you think that he's ambulatory after that, your head, for the most of your head, is comprised of your skull underneath. There's not much soft tissue damage, soft tissue areas on your head that's not going to hit something major. So when the bullet slams into your forehead, you have skin, you have a little tissue, and you have your skull right behind it. So it's a small piece of lead moving at about 600 plus miles an hour, slamming into your skull. So hard, in fact, that it breaks it and penetrates into it, partially exits the side. If you for a minute don't think that that is going to knock you out of your mental faculties, if not kill you, you're missing something. It is. It is a devastating impact to your head. You may not die from it right away, but you might. But you're sure as hell not going to be ambulatory and continuing a conversation or an argument with somebody. The gunshot to the head is going to knock you silly. What we learned is that Ryan Poston went face down onto the table. And he bled on the table. And the pooling of the blood on the table told us that he was there for a period of time. And when I say a period of time, we don't know exactly how long, but it wasn't instant because there was a substantial amount of bleeding onto the table surface. And that's not going to happen in an instant. One of the things, one of the next injuries that he sustained, there was a shot by his right armpit and towards the shoulder blade of his right side of his back. And when we talk about these gunshot wounds, we also not only want to talk about where they impacted the body, but what wound track did they take? So the one to the head hits him in the right side of the forehead and kind of travels under the skin on the right side of his head, over his temple, towards his right ear. Tells us it kind of came from straight ahead, where he was looking at the muzzle when it was discharged and struck him in the head. Now, the ones on his armpit and the ones on his right back, people say, well, he was shot in the back. Well, it might have struck the surface of his back, what is considered anatomically his back, but it didn't come from behind him because the wound track tells us the direction it traveled. So it struck him on both of those bullets struck him on the right side, not far from each other. Right back shoulder blade and right back kind of armpit. And they traveled laterally from right to left and downward within his body. So when we learn those wound tracks, we have to try to determine what position was he in when he received those gunshots, and therefore where would the firearm be that fired them? So he's seated or partially seated at the table, and he takes the one across the table, almost straight across the table into his forehead. We know at that point he goes face down on the table to the point where his glasses stayed there. Lenses down, temple tips up in a pool of blood. He then takes multiple gunshots to his right side in a wound path that says right to left and downward. Well, where would the muzzle have to be if he's face down on the table and he received those? There's no indication he was up moving around. We know he's on the table. So try to picture him face down on the table. Where would the muzzle have to be? Ryan Poston didn't move. The shooter moved. The flight path of the bullets come from a different place. They come from his right and what anatomically would be above him. But if he's face down on the table, she's walking around the table. She's moving. She actually said at one point in one of her statements that she did move around the table. Now you could say to yourself, okay, I understand that. So she shoots him in the face, the forehead. He goes face down on the table. And then she moves around the table. Stop right there. And I just want you to think about that. I want you to think about it from the mindset of the shooter. What is she doing? She's moving into a different position. He's no longer upright, sitting upright. So he's not presenting as much of a target surface to her. So what does she do? She moves to a position where she has a better viewpoint of him, or maybe a better angle of fire. And she fires twice. The interesting thing is there was not stippling on the first shot from across the table. So the powder never reached his head in a manner in which it would left those punctate injuries surrounding the bullet hole. But if she moves around the table, and his next two shots, there is stippling. One is on the skin, the other one is through the shirt, actually. He was wearing kind of a tank top, very thin cotton t-shirt. What else does that tell us now? Well, she moved closer than where she was on the first shot. This becomes very important because what is she doing? She's closing the distance on her target. So she's moving in closer, and that becomes significant, especially when you're talking about somebody who is using the claim of self-defense. And from that point, each one of these bullet holes that he's now sustained in his body, there's 3 at this point. There's one in the forehead, which he bled on the table, and there's 2 in his right side back, armpit towards the back of the arm and the back shoulder blade area, moving laterally. Another important part to understand about those bullet holes is they are now blood sources. They now have blood exposed. They're going to bleed. Now, where they bleed and how they bleed become important. We said earlier that Ryan Poston ends up on the floor to the right of the chair. Well, in between the chair and the floor, there's a large, what we call swipe pattern on the wall, and it's shaped in an arc. It's arched from the wall, curving downward towards his final resting position. And you say, where did that blood come from? Well, where could it have come from? Could it come from his forehead? Or it came from one of 2 or both of those gunshots to his backside? Which would be more logical? So as he's receiving more gunfire, he now falls from the chair. Whether he tried to move or not, I don't know, but he fell from the chair. He's no longer in the chair. On the chair now that is left behind, we have blood on the surface of the cushion that he sat on that had fallen down between his legs. We have blood on his pants, his lap. And we have this swipe pattern along the wall that is very indicative of his movement after he's bleeding. And that's the important part. There is bloodshed already. The blood is kind of leaving us a trail of body movement. And the manner in which it's deposited on the wall is very telling. So now he's on the floor. He still has 3 other gunshots. As I mentioned earlier, he was shot 6 times. When you looked at the body of Ryan Poston on the floor, there were several other things now that became evident. When Lieutenant Fornash went into that room and found Ryan Poston on the floor, he was laying partially face down and partially kind of on his right side. What was exposed now was his left side and part of his back. But you could see part of the front of his body, too. It was down low, but you could see it. His left side and his head were exposed. And he's laying there on the ground. We know he lay there on the ground. There wasn't any other movement because there was already bloodshed. We would have an expectation of other bloodstained evidence that would give us indicators of his being ambulatory, like he said, or trying to move around. And it just wasn't there. So Ryan Poston, we are confident, went to the ground and never got up. What happened then? He then sustains 3 additional gunshots. There is one towards his left armpit now, opposite side of the body, and that moves laterally too. And we have one in his chest. The interesting thing about those, especially the one on the chest, is there is gunshot residue visible on the white shirt. Again, going back to what we said earlier, that means the muzzle is moving closer. Now he's also on the ground. He's not sitting up in a chair. What that tells us is that the shooter again advanced, moved closer, and got down low. Actually moved the firearm down low and fired again. That bullet passed through the front of the chest, came out and entered the right arm. Tried to exit the right arm. On the back of the right arm was something the medical examiner identified as a short exit. Short exit is the bullet wants to come out, but the body is up against something firm. It turns out he was up against the baseboard molding on the bottom of the wall, but it went right through. It also tells us he's in that position on the floor. The armpit shot was the same, went through, same direction. So we're taking gunshots from different sides of his body. That means people are moving. In this case, they're both moving. The victim, Ryan Poston, is getting struck at the table, goes face down, struck again while he's still at the table, falls to the floor. Now he's getting struck from the opposite side of his body. The opposite side of his body is now exposed to the muzzle. In shooting, there's a very important thing you have to understand. The muzzle has to present itself to the target, and the target has to present itself to the muzzle. When a bullet is fired, it's a snapshot in time. The bullet flies and it hits a target. Barring a ricochet or any change of direction, that's what happens. And at one point, Ryan Poston's face was exposed to the muzzle. At another point, after we have movement by the shooter, Ryan Poston's right shoulder and armpit are exposed to the shooter. After he falls to the floor and his body position changes and the shooter moves again, his left side is now exposed and she's continuing to fire. The last shot, we know this because the medical examiner had told us that he was alive until he sustained this last shot. This last shot was in his head, and it was in the left side of his forehead, just above the hairline. An interesting note to this shot: there was stippling surrounding this bullet hole, this bullet entry wound, which means she was close. Why is this important to us? Well, we take that firearm and it gets tested now. The firearms examiners will take it into a lab. They will fire it. They will test it for operability. Make sure there's no malfunction, so nobody can say, well, the gun malfunctioned and that's why this all happened. And then what they'll do is they'll do what's called muzzle to target distance tests. They take that gun with that ammunition, and they will fire it into test standards. And generally what they are is square pieces of material, like kind of a white cotton t-shirt material sometimes is what they use. And they can use them as controls. It was done in a controlled environment, from a controlled known distance, from muzzle to target, and we can then recreate distance patterns. We can give a threshold of where the muzzle was from the target based on the injury patterns that were left on the victim or the gunshot residue patterns that were left on the shirt. We can recreate them and say, look, this is where the muzzle was. And that's one of the reasons why we're able to say that Shayna Hubers shot from across the table first. We don't believe there was a struggle because nothing on the table was disturbed. We're able to say that Ryan Poston went face down onto the table and bled heavily onto that table. We're then able with confidence to say she went around the table. She also gave us that bit of information later on. She corroborated what we were thinking. She fired 2 more rounds from a different location. She closed the distance. He then fell. She then closed the distance again. And you might say, well, she really didn't have to walk very far. It doesn't matter. She kneeled down and put the muzzle down to be able to hit him in the chest, which was only partially exposed, leaving gunshot residues and an additional wound track. And her last shot was close to the head. Now, when they did the test, they said 2.5 to 3 feet, muzzle to target. That's not that far. And she's leaving stippling patterns on his back, and on his forehead. So what we were able to determine, and this is how you have to break it down. The individual being shot, the individual receiving this gunfire is Ryan Poston. The individual doing the shooting, which means the individual in control, in total control of the firearm, is Shayna Hubers. There are 6 shots fired. There are 6 hits. She is in total control of this firearm. And in the course of those 6 shots, we have determined that she is moving and closing the distance to her target as she repeatedly fires the weapon. That's very significant. Now, 6 shots fired, 6 hits. Let's talk about that for a minute. Many people that might listen to this watch a lot of TV. I can't tell you how many times we've heard people, what I think are normally educated, intelligent people, will say, I don't understand why the police had to shoot him. Why couldn't they shoot him in the hand or the knee or the shoulder? I've said this before on this show. It's a question that stems from not understanding